Hi folks, welcome back to the Who is God module. This week we're moving on to look at the evidence for God. So let me bring you to that point to see how it fits together. We've looked first of all at the concept of God, how people have different ideas of what there might be out there, whether there's a God or not. And then we looked at the God of the Bible. And we looked at what he is like and how he describes himself, his names, the pictures of God, and what he is like as a Trinity. And as we explain that, then we want to ask, well, does the evidence match that? Does the evidence say, well, that is the God that is there? Do we see in our world and in our universe and in our experience evidence for God? So that's what we're going to try and do. So we'll first of all discuss the idea of evidence, and then we'll quickly get into some of the evidence for God. There are different kinds of evidence, but we need to step back even from that to understand what evidence is. People say they want proof that there's God. They want proof that there's a God out there, but proof is a mathematical thing. We use mathematical theorems to combine them to prove other mathematical theorems. We do tests of analytical facts, statements made in mathematics. We compare them and put them together and change them around so that we can create another theorem or another mathematical fact. Evidence is a very different thing from proof. What we do in most of science is we study what there is. Science being knowledge, science, just the word, God is omniscient. He knows all things. So science is just knowledge, and studying and gathering knowledge is about looking at evidence. Most of the time that is not proof. There's so many things that we examine and study and know and are confident are true that there is no empirical proof for. Let me give you some examples. If I was to say, right, I'm going to study whether I can throw a stone, let's make it 40 meters, right? I can throw a stone 40 meters. Well, we can look at me throw it and we can judge, we can test it, and we can see, and we can measure how far I've thrown it, and I've thrown it 40 meters. So you say, yes, you can, but that's not proof. Because I did it once does not mean I can always do it. It is not proof. It's evidence that I can throw it 40 meters, but it's not proof. It's verification. It's saying, well, that is evidence that you can do it. We can even look at the biomechanics of my body, my arm, and how strong I am, and the projectile, and the weight, and the mass of me, and the idea of whether I can do it, and the mechanics of throwing. And you can say, yes, you should be able to do that. The evidence says that because of your weight and the strength of your arm and the movement, you can create this much momentum, which creates this much of a force on the object you're throwing, and the object goes a certain distance, and it should, if you have the right angle, go more than 40 meters. We still have lots of evidence like that, but it is not empirical proof. The idea of proof is that something is mathematically correct, and infinity has no proof. It's an impossibility. So the idea of proof for God is unrealistic. It is not a thing. You cannot prove one way or another. Whether there is a theorem that you can join up to prove that God created the universe. But we can look at evidence. We can look at what is out there, what we can see, what we can experience, and what we've seen in history, what it tells us of all that's going on. And that can therefore verify whether there's a God or not. I hope you understand that, and I hope it doesn't sound too obtuse. But it's important that we understand that what we can do is look at evidence for ourselves and show other people evidence, but we're not going to prove to them that there's a God, just as they're not going to prove to us that there isn't. I don't know if you've ever heard the story about a professor saying, oh, there's no God, and a Christian student standing up and saying, no, there is. And he says, well, if there's a God, then he'll make me, when I drop this piece of chalk, it won't break. And then he drops it accidentally and it rolls down his leg and it doesn't break. And they say, proof for God. That's never proof. That could be evidence, but it is definitely not proof. Proof is a thing that we cannot do. One of the issues you see people have is that they say science has disproved God. Well, that is impossible because there is no mathematical statements that relate to God. There is no formal structure of understanding for God that you could prove or disprove him. What we can do is look at science, look at history, look at experience, and say, does it match with the evidence? Does it match that evidence with the identity of God from the Bible? Okay, does that help you understand where we're coming from in this section of the module? So as you're thinking about the idea of evidence, the question is, what evidence is there that helps support your faith, and what would make you question your faith? What evidence is there that people give that suggests there is a God, and what evidence is there that people give that suggests there might not be a God? Pause the video and think about it for a moment, and then we will look at 3 categories of evidence. Okay, so we're going to start with what we're looking for when we're looking at evidence. With evidence, we're looking to either agree with and affirm some hypothesis that we're making, some idea that we have, or challenge it in such a way that we might say that it is not true. When we're looking at evidence, we want to know, does that confirm what I think, or does that go against what I think? And so we start with a statement that we are then going to test. Science does a lot of testing. Looking for evidence is essentially testing theories and ideas. When an apple dropped and we had gravity, and Newton's thinking, well, he tests it, he measures it, he weighs it, he works out the height and the speed, and he's working out what's going on. He's trying to test gravity. He's not trying to prove it, because proof for gravity, again, is not a mathematical thing that we can do easily. But what we do is we come up with a statement. He says there is a connection between 2 bodies that pulls them together. And he calls it gravitational pull. And then he tests that. And we're going to ask the same kind of question. If we look at it scientifically, what we would like to test is the hypothesis that the God of the Bible is true, that there is a God, and he's the God of the Bible. There is a null hypothesis, an opposite, which is that there's no God. And I think it's very difficult to look at evidence out there and think there's no God at all. I know it's taught in schools as scientific fact, and it frustrates me so much because that is not scientific evidence. There is not that groundswell of evidence that there is no God. There is an alternate hypothesis that there is a God, but it is not the God of the Bible. And that one is a little more difficult because we're comparing similar things. So if, for example, our hypothesis had been there is a gravitational pull between 2 objects, then the null hypothesis would say there is no pull between 2 objects. So when I hold an apple and drop it, it is not pulled to the ground, right? But what the alternate hypothesis might be is that there's a different kind of pull between objects, and that would be much harder to tell apart. And so as we look at this, you might say, well, that is evidence that there is a God. And some of the evidence might specifically be that there is not just a God, but the God of the Bible. So let's try and think scientifically about some of the evidence that's out there and ask the question, does this say there is a God and it's the God of the Bible? There is no God, or it looks like there is a God. It may or may not be the God of the Bible. It may be some other God. So as we're looking at evidence, always have those three ideas beside the evidence, as saying which of these ideas is it confirming or supporting. And let's have a look at some of the evidence then. We're going to start with physical evidence, and I think we'll be lucky if we get through that today. And then we'll look later at historical evidence and experiential evidence. Now, although people think those are less certain, we have relied on historical evidence in courts of law for thousands of years. We've relied on experiential evidence in so many other realms of life. So these are not irrelevant. But let's start with some of the physical evidence. I've just listed a few here. What we're going to do with these is just think through what you might see. Let's start with universal science. I am not the sort of astrophysicist who knows all about the universe. But what I do understand about the universe is that it is way beyond our comprehension. We can tell from the universe different, like gravitational pulls, different forces, different chemical makeups and compounds, different like scientific links between all that goes on in the universe. And the universe does not seem to be random. If we go back to before, where we were discussing the hypothesis, if the God of the Bible is true, then there should be design. You should see design, his design, with his plan. If there is no God, you should see randomness. You should see accident and mistake. And as we look at universal science, we'll see that there seems to be no accidents, no mistakes. There seems to be design on the grandest of scale. All of the universe is held together. Things move, bodies move apart from each other and towards each other. The fact that we live in a solar system that is absolutely at the perfect setting, everything is just right for life to develop and to be maintained. The assumption is that the sun, that great ball of, well, it's not fire, but that great ball has just been perfectly in that absolutely perfect state for hundreds of millions of years. And yet we think, oh, the sun will not last another million years. It will last so many hundreds of, and we look at it and we think, well, we can see such perfection in the distance from the sun, in the nature of the sun, in the stability of the sun, in the planets that are around. We can see that life could only exist if everything is just the way it is. The tilt of the earth, the angle, the distance from the sun, all of this is perfect. And this universal science says there is design here. There is a plan here. And we see things that last for thousands of years, for hundreds of thousands of years. We see complexity, we see perfection. And we can say in science that there is a clear pattern, a clear organization, a clear perfection that is not random. Now, there may be other gods. It might be that another God has set things up in perfection. But I don't think that perfection comes from randomness. I don't think you can have enough randomness to ever get perfection. They say that, I don't know if you know this, the idea of the chimpanzees typing on typewriters. And eventually, if you have an infinite number of chimpanzees typing on typewriters, one of them will eventually type out the works of Shakespeare. And you think, well, that seems ludicrously unlikely, although infinite is infinite. And with every combination of letters, the odds are that any combination could be correct. Essentially like winning the lottery one week and then winning it again the next week. There's no reason you wouldn't. There's no reason the same lottery balls don't come up week after week. And because real randomness is not infinite, but if you have an infinite number of combinations, it will include all the random possibilities. However, when we think about that, about these monkeys typing on typewriters, even if they typed out the words of Shakespeare, they wouldn't understand that they were the words of Shakespeare. Nobody would know it because nobody would be there to observe it. And yet we can observe the science and the perfection in the universe, from the tiniest atoms and how they're held together and how each molecule is made up of different atoms. And we see all of it. You see the different protons and neutrons and electrons, and they talk even smaller than that, and I don't get it. And then we can see the size of the universe and constellations and galaxies. And until 100 years ago, we didn't even know there was anything beyond our galaxy. And yet now they're talking about 100 billion galaxies with 100 billion stars in each galaxy. Massive universe, and too perfect and too accurate and too complex to have come from just an accident. I think there's too much of science, not just in the universe, but I think there's too much of science says this is perfect. We can measure this. This is accurate. This is correct. This is consistent. And perfection and consistency are not random, are not accidental. They are clear indicators of design. So if we have design, we have a designer. I think there is a lot of scientific evidence, even the things that people try and use to refute Christianity, like carbon dating, just the fact that carbon is absolutely perfectly consistent in its half-life from carbon-14 to carbon-12, that we can measure it. It's just so consistent that we can gather age from an object based on this beautiful atom. That is how we should be admiring science, and it should make us admire the perfection and the correctness of all that is. So I think there's a lot of evidence in science that suggests there is a God. I don't know where the evidence for randomness is. People who don't want there to be a God are obviously looking for randomness. They come up with concepts that have randomness in them. For example, the Big Bang theory is a theory based on the idea that if there's no God, well, how could a universe come into being? And it would have to be a random act. And this random act would have to create galaxies and stars. And you think, how does one explosion create all this universe? One explosion. I think science suggests that's very unlikely. Along with the Big Bang theory, we might propose the theory of evolution. Now, there's evidence for microevolution, that things adapt to their environment. We ourselves, if I lived in the sun, would eventually get a little bit darker, and pasty white as it is, but I could get darker because my skin will adjust and things change and things adapt to their environment. We see that. But then there's a jump from that to, well, things must have developed like this over millions of years. And I don't think that there's randomness and accident in what we have seen of evolution, things adapt to their environment to be better for their environment. That is not accidental. That is not random. That is adaptation, which is healthy and helpful. So I think that the ideas that people include, that they call science, are actually unscientific, because science is accurate, consistent, detailed, and perfect. Proof is, when we have proofs, it's perfect proof. So we can see it. It's not a question that we can debate. That there is that fact. And science, whether it's proofs mathematically or whether it's evidence from scientific experimentation, we can see consistency, perfection, accuracy. And then people say, but this has all come from random. And I don't see that jump. I don't see it in anything. I don't understand logically how perfection comes from randomness. It is like the monkeys and the typewriter, but nobody knows what those monkeys are going to produce, and what they produce is irrelevant because nobody sees it. And even if the randomness will eventually produce the works of Shakespeare, it requires infinite randomness, and we don't have an infinite universe. We have a very, very large universe, but it is not infinite. If we have 100 billion galaxies with 100 billion stars, that means we have 100 billion times 100 billion possibilities of a star being exactly right for life. That is nowhere near infinite. It's massive, but it's nowhere near infinite. Okay, I've talked too long probably on the science section. You'll see we'll struggle to get through this list. As second, along with the science, we see in our world creation and design. We see life cycles and cycles of creation, whether it's the water cycle or the fact that, you know, the small animal eats the fly, the big animal eats the small animal, and then when the big animal dies, the fly eats the big animal. You get these loops of things. We get cycles that make life possible, whether it's, like I said, the water cycle or the air cycle, that trees breathe what we breathe out, and we breathe in what trees breathe out. That design is everywhere. We see all this evidence for things that are meant to be together, whether it's the parasites that keep an animal alive, and yet it's only the host that keeps the parasite alive. How could they develop together randomly? They can't do it randomly. There must be a design. There must be a plan. One cannot exist without the other. And there's a number of evidences of these. Or it's the adaptation of species for their environment that is impossible to have randomly happened. For example, the giraffe with two valves in its neck, one at the top and one at the bottom, to stop the blood flowing in and out of its head and killing it when it leans over and leans back up again. It would die either way if those valves weren't there. But those valves are not going to develop unless the neck develops, and the neck can't develop without the valves. And so you have three things that coexist, that couldn't, God designed them that way. The design and accuracy and consistency of all that's in creation and the way it's held together, the cycles of creation are stunning and so consistent and real that they suggest a designer. Design always suggests a designer. Beauty. You could understand beauty in an evolutionary sense when it relates to mating. Although mating itself is a weird idea, evolution in evolution. But in terms of mating, I want to find a mate attractive so that we will come together and create the next in our line of species. That makes sense, right? We could see beauty maybe in food, something that we must have. So if I find food beautiful, I'm more likely to eat it. I find it attractive in a very different sense from the mate, I hope. The different calls, the buzz of bumblebees, the beauty of flowers. Flowers are meant to be, they say, well, maybe beautiful so that bees and wasps go from one flower to the next, and because they look good and they can, But actually, bees and wasps go for food. They don't need to be beautiful. But anyway, whatever it might be, that's why they're beautiful to bees and wasps. But they're beautiful to us. Music is beautiful. I have no idea what concept music has. It's too much. There's too much beauty. And so I think beauty is a big sign that there's a creator who has beautiful ideas. Along with beauty, there's complexity. Complexity and uniqueness. There is no evolutionary value in uniqueness. If the strongest survive, well, then we'll all be exactly like the strongest. That is the best way to be. There is no need for each of us to be unique and complex. There's no need for weakness. Diseases would be eradicated if the styles and ideas that we have, our thought processes are all individual, our decision making is all individual. And that complexity is not random. If evolution were the key factor in the creation of human beings, there is a lot that wouldn't be true. We'll come to sin and love and logic and industry and life and death in a moment, which I don't think makes sense. But when we see the complexity of our decision making and how we go about things and how we make so many mistakes and there's correction and there's difference and choice about, we think we know stuff, and yet, you know, the greatest biological scientist has one field that he knows 5% of. You know, there's so much in creation that is complex and balanced and perfect, and there's so much to see. So many plants, so many animals, so much in humanity, so much in our created world, that we should admire the complexity of it and then say, well, why is there so much complexity? It's because there's the example of a sheep. I mean, those things would not evolve if we were to try and create them, because we can tend them and we can sort of help them evolve to a way that they're docile and we can work with them. But there's just no starting point. There's just no starting point that makes sense. We have such an amazing world, and it's complex and unique. Along with that, we'll just try and rush through these thoughts. I don't like to rush it, but I can't keep you here forever. Sin and love, the two opposite ends of a spectrum, suggest that this world is not random. Man's evilness to man can be so direct and so terrible and so beyond evolution. It is so full of malice and brokenness that it would not make sense. It's not just a survival of a species or a protection of a piece of area of land or a development of power. It is just pure malice. And that sort of sin is not just a challenge to evolution. It is very unevolutionary. It's saying that what we do is decisively and carefully chosen to be against someone else. And that sort of sin is horrible, but it's evidence that there's something going on that is not accidental. At the other end of that scale is love. I apologize for that moment there. Oh, dear me, I need to go back. And we're talking about sin, and we're saying at the other end of the scale is love. That something that is strong would lay down their life for the weak, not in the hope that that weak will eventually become strong, but just to lay down your life for another. I get the evolutionary concept of protecting your young and dying for your young, but that is not the same as dying for the weak that are not yours, for protecting the vulnerable, the slaves, those with mental health problems or physical health problems, those that are struggling with all kinds of life, and we protect and structure our world to save them and to look after them. Love is not accidental. It is not random. It is a choice. It's accurate and it's decisive. And when we love, we choose to be good. We choose to invest in others. We choose to make something happen. So sin and love both say that there is accuracy, there is purpose, there is meaning, there is more to life. If everything was random, strong would get stronger, weak would disappear. If everything was random, the strong would step on the weak. We have a morality that says it is not okay to abuse children. And yet, in evolution, that makes no sense. That morality is because we know there's more to this. We know there's more meaning, there's more purpose, there's more design than randomness. So randomness doesn't really work with either sin or love. Man's ability to search the universe and to get out there and to examine more, and his desire to see more, to understand and to investigate, man's industry in creation is actually evidence for God. We are made curious and creative. We like to expand and look at more. In the Bible, it says that God said to man, go and be fruitful and subdue the world and investigate it. Go and be in charge of it. And we don't see that in other species. We're nothing like other species. I often think about whether, if the birds did decide they wanted to take over the world and they started attacking people, we don't really have a comeback against them. I mean, we can kill some of them, but they'll give us a good game. And there's millions and billions of them around the world. But birds don't. It's not in their nature to expand, to take over territories, to go and attack the world. That is a human thing. And that desire to know more comes from a God who is creative and wants to know more and wants us to investigate and wants us to see. Doesn't mean he wants us to go out and kill and ruin and destroy, but our ability to look at things and to think of things with logic and to examine things more thoroughly. Our ability to be logical suggests that randomness is wrong. Our ability to understand evolution should in itself explain that evolution is not the theory that proves our existence, is not how we came about. The logic that we have to investigate it says that we think beyond, we look at more than, we understand bigger. And that doesn't come from a process of just developing. It's just not a natural end of a cycle or a process of development. Logic and decision-making and industry and creativity are all things that say we've been made for more than this. We are looking to see what is going on. We are developed to understand and to be part of the bigger universe. And finally, in terms of just some of the physical evidence, life and death are a little bit illogical. What we try and do is make ourselves live longer. The average lifespan in the UK has gone up in a little bit over the last few years, over the last century, that our life lasts longer. And yet it is such a short time. Death comes to us all. The first thing that evolution would try and root out is death. The first thing that it would do is try and take that weakness out of play to maintain humanity longer. Aging is a process that we still don't understand very well. Why do we age? Why is this beard a little bit grey when a few years ago it wasn't? Why is in the bag under my eyes so evident now when I was younger and fitter? Why? What made me get older? Why do we have a lifespan and a death? Why are we not made to live longer? Design. It's difficult to explain that is designed if we don't have an eternity, if there isn't a meaning that goes beyond. But it is also not evolutionary. Think of the evolutionary processes we've moved away from by accident. Surely cell splitting is the best way of reproduction. Mating is very inefficient. Human mating is very inefficient. We look at the things that we've moved away from in terms of life lasting longer. There are species that lasted longer. We look at mobility. We've become less mobile than some creatures. There's lots of things we've moved away from that in evolution are better than what we have. And life and death are two things that suggest design. I know that sounds weird, but randomness would work away from life and death. It would work away from death at every possibility. And yet, having a life cycle, having a lifespan suggests that someone knew what we were created for and how that should not be forever. There is a plan for forever, but without that forever plan, life and death don't make sense. I hope that isn't confusing you or causing you conflict. There's a lot that in what we've discussed that you can go and research and think about more deeply. You might look at all the evidence and see different things. But we look at evidence and we ask, well, what is it there for? Does it show that we're designed? Design suggests a designer. Complexity suggests a designer who has infinite ideas. Beauty suggests a designer who has creativity and artistic talent. And all of the morality and all of the meaning and all that we see in the universe fitting together shows us perfection and design and a goal. Now, if that's not there, if we are accidents, if we are random, I don't think any of it looks the way it does. Life would not have developed to prioritize what it prioritizes. And I think there's enough evidence of that in the physical world. We'll go on to look at historical evidence and experiential evidence next week, but I hope this has been helpful and not too complicated.